By December 18, 1944, the German attack in the Ardennes was no longer a surprise, it was a crisis. 3 days earlier, Allied commanders had expected a limited offensive, something loud but manageable. Instead, German spearheads had punched far deeper than anticipated, slipping through thinly held American lines and racing west along narrow roads the Allies barely controlled. What made the situation dangerous wasn't just the ground being lost, it was the speed. Reports from the front were arriving late, sometimes contradictory, and headquarters no longer had a clear picture of where the enemy actually was. Quietly and without saying it publicly, Allied planners began to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The German breakthrough, the bulge in the Allied lines, might actually hold. Those first 72 hours mattered because this was the only window in which the German offensive could succeed. At this stage, the Allies still had the advantage in men, fuel, and air power. But none of that mattered if the front collapsed before it could be brought to bear. The German plan depended on speed. If their columns could keep moving, they could rupture the Allied line and force a crisis far larger than a single battle. This wasn't yet a grinding fight. It was a race between momentum and response. Every hour the Germans advanced unchecked, the more chaotic the Allied situation became, and the harder it would be to seal the breach. If the attack could be slowed early, it would fail. But if it wasn't, the consequences would stretch far beyond the Ardennes. For those few days in mid-December, the outcome of the offensive was still undecided, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous part. The Ardennes had been chosen precisely because it looked unimportant. For months, it had been treated as a quiet sector, a place to rest exhausted units, rotate inexperienced troops into the line, and rebuild strength. Compared to the brutal fighting elsewhere, this stretch of forest seemed safe. And that assumption shaped everything. American divisions were spread thin, holding long frontages with limited reserves behind them. Many of the troops had never seen major combat. Defensive positions were light, roadblocks were few, and fallback lines barely existed. Worse still, the weather turned against the Allies at exactly the wrong moment. Thick cloud cover and winter fog grounded aircraft, stripping away the single advantage that normally crushed German movement: overwhelming Allied air power. When the attack came, it hit a sector that was lightly defended, poorly observed, and effectively blind. And in warfare, blindness is often fatal. Once the German attack broke through the initial defenses, it accelerated rapidly. Instead of grinding forward, German columns pushed past resistance whenever possible, leaving isolated American units behind. Strong points were avoided, not destroyed. Roads mattered more than territory, and speed mattered more than losses. That decision paid off. German spearheads reached key junctions faster than Allied planners expected, often appearing in places headquarters still believed were secure. Messages from the front became increasingly fragmented. Some units reported contact, others suddenly going silent. As the front stretched and bent, confusion spread faster than the enemy. Retreats weren't coordinated. Supply convoys ran into advancing German units. Commanders struggled to determine where the line actually was, or if one existed at all. By the end of the second day, the breakthrough was no longer theoretical, it was moving. By the third day, the danger was no longer abstract. The town of Bastogne, a vital road hub, was cut off, its defenders surrounded as German columns flowed past on multiple sides. With Bastogne isolated, the road network feeding the Allied front began to unravel. Supply routes were severed or threatened, and units on the line found themselves short of ammunition, fuel, and clear orders. At higher headquarters, maps lagged behind reality. German movements were advancing faster than reports could confirm them. For the first time, Allied planners were forced to shift their language. This was no longer about stopping the attack at the frontier. It was about preventing the breakthrough from widening. What made the moment so dangerous wasn't just the ground being lost, it was the sense that control itself was slipping away. The German plan didn't depend on perfection, it depended on momentum. By avoiding prolonged fights and pushing relentlessly west, German commanders forced the Allies into a reactive posture. Decisions were made late, reserves were committed piecemeal, and coordination lagged behind events on the ground. Confusion became a force multiplier. Units that might have held if properly supported instead withdrew, unsure of their flanks. Others fought hard but were bypassed, contributing little to slowing the advance. For a brief moment, the German offensive created exactly the conditions it needed: speed, uncertainty, and time. And as long as those conditions held, the possibility of a wider collapse remained very real. Momentum, however, is fragile. As German columns pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the strain began to show. Fuel shortages slowed spearheads that had outrun their supplies. Narrow roads became clogged, and detours cost time the offensive could not afford to lose. At the same time, Allied resistance began to harden. Isolated units delayed advances longer than expected, and key road junctions were held just long enough to disrupt the German timetable. The attack that relied on speed was now fighting the clock. Every delay reduced its chances, and by the end of the third day, the offensive was still moving, but no longer racing. As the weather began to clear, the balance shifted. Allied aircraft returned to the skies, striking German columns stalled on exposed roads. With fuel running low and momentum slipping away, the offensive that had once threatened to break the front began to slow everywhere at once. The window had closed. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but its most dangerous moment had already passed, not because the Germans were stopped outright, but because they had run out of time. The front stabilized, but inside the Allied command, the consequences of those chaotic days were only just beginning, and the aftermath of those days would ignite a controversy that changed who was allowed to speak for the Allied victory.